Proverbs 16, I'm just going to start reading with this one verse. It says, Proverbs 16:4, "The Lord has made all for himself, yes, even the wicked, for the day of doom." As we think through and keep thinking through the problem of evil, one of the questions that we're working through is, if God is good and all-powerful, then why does he allow evil to continue? And particularly our focus is on moral evil. As we talked a few weeks ago, natural evil, the disasters, diseases, those kinds of things, are the judgment of sin. And so that God, in his permission of them, is just and holy in allowing sinful creation to feel the consequences and to suffer the consequences of their sin. And so this question goes back farther. Why did God allow moral evil in the first place, and why does he allow it to continue? As we think through the character of God, and we say God is good, God is holy, God is all-powerful, God is just, and he is the judge of all of creation, then the question is raised and legitimately asked, well, then why is there still so much sin? Why did God allow it to continue? Why did God allow it to begin? And so I've already mentioned this, we divided into two kinds of evil. We defined moral evil last week with three components: disobedience to the commands of God, disregard of the purposes of God, and distortion of the worship of God. And so we have all three of these together, or either together or any individual aspect of it. It makes up that which is morally evil. And so one of the reasons I've said that, and we've defined it in that way, is we have to be careful not to treat evil, moral evil, as if it is a substance on its own, as if something that somehow came into being, as a thing. And so we see it rather in relation to the character of God and the plans of God, so that moral evil is that which does not conform to the perfection, plan, and purpose of God. It is a distortion or a damaging of that which God originally created. And so we have now, talking about I know I said this last week, so I'm just going to mention these very briefly. Evil is not a thing to be created. It is not the absence of good. And I know I mentioned last week I'm quibbling with some brilliant theologians on this matter. And most notably, Augustine and John Calvin both defined evil as the absence of good. And the illustration, I believe, was Augustine that used it, talked about evil is the absence of good, like cold is the absence of heat, or darkness is the absence of light. I rather would say that evil is the improper addition of something to good. So I use the illustration of gold. You take pure gold, you do not make gold impure by taking away gold. You make gold impure by adding something and something inappropriate into that gold. And likewise, which I'm going to try to prove this here when we get to talking about Lucifer's sin, likewise, what we see with evil is not some taking away from that which is good, but adding something inappropriate into that which was good. Evil was not unplanned. It was not unforeseen, but God knew all along. And we're intentionally ignoring the very significant question of, did God plan it or foresee it? And there's a lot of debate on that point, and I'm not going to delve into that. It's outside the scope of what we're looking at. And there's certainly room for differences of opinion on whether God planned evil or permitted evil. And so we're going to leave that alone. Evil is the willful rebellion of the creature to worship a creation instead of the Creator. And we see this most notably explained in Romans chapter 1, summarized as exchanging the truth of God for the lie, worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator. And so that brings us now to the origin of moral evil. Because we need to understand these two passages to really understand the whole question. So Isaiah 14, verse 12. Now, in both Isaiah and Ezekiel, what we have happening is prophecy against, in Isaiah 14, the king of Babylon, in Ezekiel 28, the king of Tyre, the city Tyre. And yet we see in the prophetic judgment of these individuals, we also see judgment and condemnation of the one who's behind the scenes, if you will, moving these individuals. And we know at least one other case in Scriptures where there is a very definite condemnation of a creature and also the condemnation of the evil spirit behind the creature. In Genesis chapter 3, the curse of the serpent, we see the physical creature is cursed, but we also see that Satan is cursed. In the same verses, really, there's no clear division. God doesn't say to the serpent, I'm cursing you, and then say, and now to Satan I say, but rather it's one curse, and we recognize, though, that there are two creatures being cursed in that. And I would say the same is going on in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. And so verse 12 of Isaiah 14, it says, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. I will be like the Most High. But God says to him, you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. Those who see you will gaze at you and consider you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook the kingdoms? And so now it begins to shift back to the king of Babylon. But we have, particularly in verses 12 to 15, the focus on Lucifer, recognizing that the king of Babylon is being motivated, he's being driven by this satanic spirit. And he is motivated not, of course, by a godly spirit, but by Satan himself. And so God looks beyond the king of Babylon to that motivating spirit and addresses the being behind the scenes, who is called Lucifer here, which we know to be Satan. Yet there is this very obvious self-focus, self-exaltation. I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I would understand stars to be referring to angels. We see that in the Old Testament, a couple different places where stars are referenced to the angels. And I think that's what Satan's saying here, that he is going to be greater than any of the other angels. He's going to sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north, so elevating his throne to the very highest throne, so that he says, the fifth statement he makes is, I will be like the Most High. So Satan, in his sin, seeks to elevate himself to be like God. Now, Ezekiel 28. It says, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. And at this part, especially this opening phrases there, that could certainly be a mortal man. He was a great, mighty king, a beautiful, powerful king, full of wisdom. But then verse 13, we immediately recognize, okay, this can't be a living king in the days of Ezekiel or any king prophesied after Ezekiel, because it says you were in Eden, the garden of God. The only people in Eden were who? Yeah, Adam and Eve. Neither one of them was ever king of Tyre, as far as we know. It has to be something else, someone else. So you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrel and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. And then verse 14, it says, you were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. So not only was he in Eden, but he was also in heaven, in the very court of God, in the closest proximity to him. It says you were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. And that's a crucial phrase. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings that they might gaze at you. So particularly verse 17, we have this glorious angelic being in the presence of God that was created by God. And in verse 15, it tells us he was created perfect. So this creature that we're talking about was not created sinful, was created perfect. But verse 17, we see the pride. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. So we have Narcissus here, examining himself and exalting his own beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. So this being was created not just in a place, and we would assume, I think rightfully so, with a purpose, but he was created with great wisdom. So if we understand, and we tie this back to Isaiah chapter 6, and we speak of the angels that are there around the throne of God, exalting the glory of God, and we see this angel there in the very presence of God, this cherub which covers. Now, jump back into the book of Exodus and think about the tabernacle. They built a box for to go inside the darkest room of the tabernacle, all the way in the back, the most holy place. In that box, they put the two stones on which were written the Ten Commandments. They put a pot of manna, Aaron's staff that budded. And what do we call that box that was in the most holy place? It was the only piece of furniture in the most holy place. Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant. On top of that was what's called the mercy seat. And on each side of the mercy seat were two angels, and they were facing in with their wings stretched out toward the other, covering this mercy seat. And those angels are called, what? Does anybody know? Cherubim. So if we read this, and we read that this is a covering cherub, I think it is legitimate to conclude that this creature was in the very presence of God and was tasked with something similar to that which the angels on the mercy seat represented, covering this place where the glory of God resided. They're ministering in the very presence of the glory of God. And so that you have this creature perfectly created with beauty and wisdom, to minister properly in the very presence of the glory of God. And I would say from what else we know of Scriptures, the proper ministry there is a ministry of worship. Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, the whole earth is full of your glory. That's what the seraphim cry out in Isaiah 6. And that's what we see in Revelation, I believe it's chapter 5, crying out the same thing. The praises of the holiness and the greatness of God. And this cherub there in the very presence of God, created in beauty and perfection and wisdom for the praise and worship of God. Now, you think about that, because we've been talking about the character of God. As we've been working through these various things, we've tried to understand some of what it means. We can kind of grasp that God is all-knowing. I mean, we can't really figure it out, but we can say, okay, He knows everything that ever was, ever will be. He has all knowledge of all time at His fingertips right now. And I can't really comprehend it, but I can say it, and I think I can understand it, sort of. We talk about His eternality. He has no beginning, no ending. God has eternally existed exactly as He is. And my mind says, I don't have a clue what that means. Again, I can say kind of time, outside of time. You get me trying to think about no beginning. I can't even describe how I don't understand it. That's how little I understand it. We talk about the Trinity, and we wrestle through the nature of the Trinity, that you have one God who is three, so that the Father is distinct from the Son is distinct from the Spirit's distinct from the Father, yet each one is fully God. He possesses the eternal essence and glory of God, and yet each one is three distinct persons. But God is not three gods. He is one God. And by this point in time, my brain's saying, please let me go home and rest. And now you have this angel created to worship the infinite God. I think there's a little bit of wisdom necessary to even begin to properly worship this God. And I would say Lucifer was probably the wisest, or one of the wisest of the angels, entrusted with this incredible task of expressing worship to God and trying to reflect back the magnificence of the greatness of God. And yet, go back, look again at verse 17. What happened to his wisdom? It was corrupted. Who corrupted it? He did. So, because of what? For the sake of what? His own splendor. And honestly, this is just mind-boggling to me. But that Lucifer there is in the very presence of God to worship God, created in a beauty and a magnificence and a wisdom to rightly reflect back the beauty and the greatness of the majesty of the glory of God. And he starts looking in the mirror. There's a brilliance there that is the most beautiful that's ever been or ever will be. And he takes these incredible gifts to proclaim the greatness of God, and he turns them to proclaim his own. He's there to lift up the glory of God, and he turns and says, I will be lifted up. I will be like God. He's created to worship God. There's created in him this, if you will, this longing for God, this love for God. But in his sin, he corrupted that longing for God and twisted it to be a longing to be God. And that's why I say that this is a corruption, a distortion, a perversion of the purpose and the worship of God. In Satan Lucifer was given all that was needed to rightly worship God. But at some point in time, he started looking down instead of up. Started looking within instead of at the glory in front of him, and he began to apply those incredible gifts to himself. And so he sinned. And so we see that Lucifer's sin was, as we already said, first and foremost prized. I will, I will, I will. It was a rejection of his created purpose. He is there to be in the service of God. And again, though I don't know of a text that specifically says it, I think it's reasonable to conclude he was created to worship God. But he rejected that purpose. He didn't create something new, and this is important. He's created to glorify God, to worship God. He doesn't reject that to come up with some brand new thing. Rather, he takes worship and exaltation, and he adds into it that which is not appropriate. He is given the ability to worship and exalt God, and what he does with that is he says, I want to worship me. He now inserts self into this purpose, and so he rejects it, and he ultimately rebels. But what he's done in the first two, I'm really just summarizing it in the third one. What he has done in his pride is rejecting that purpose. He has walked away from the reason that he was created, to worship and serve the creature. What creature did Lucifer worship and serve? Himself. As magnificent as he is, and I don't think we're going to find any created thing more magnificent than Lucifer was, he was not the creator. He may have modeled the glory and the beauty of God far better than anything else that's ever been created, but he was still a creature. And he rebelled against the worship and service of his Creator to worship and serve self. And so I would say the sin of Lucifer is, again, not an addition, not coming up with something brand new in the universe, but rather is taking that perfect thing which God had created it and exerting self to now make this good thing, worship and service, an evil thing. So this is how we have sin enter the universe. Lucifer rebels and twists his created purpose for his own selfish purposes. How does that sin now get to the world? Now, Satan's in heaven. And that's where we go to Adam and Eve. And I'm not going to turn there. I'm trusting that you're familiar enough with the Genesis 3 that you can mentally walk through it. But we know Lucifer came to Eve and he began to question her. Did God say? She answers him. He begins now this process of undermining and then denying what God said. And when Satan tempted Eve to eat the fruit, he promised her something. He said that God doesn't want you to eat it because of why? God didn't want them to become what? Like him. Yeah, wise like God. Satan's temptation of Eve is actually the same sin that he fell into. I will be like the Most High. He comes to Eve and says, take this fruit. You'll be like the Most High. God's keeping that back from you. He doesn't want you to be like him. And Eve believes the lie, eats the fruit, and she falls. Adam, and this is really interesting, and Scripture doesn't give me near enough information to talk about it, except for it just simply says that Adam was not deceived. I don't know why Adam chose to disobey. There's a lot of speculations have been offered. He didn't, whatever he may have overheard, we don't know where he was when Lucifer was tempting Eve or any of that. So whatever reason, Adam said, okay, I'm in. I'll disobey God. And he chose to disobey. And so that Adam and Eve, what Ecclesiastes 7:29 tells us, is that they sought their own will, not the will of God. Truly, this only have I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes, many of their own devices, is what he's talking about. God made man perfect. He looked at all of creation and said, it is very good. But man said, no, I want something else. I won't. I mean, really, it's the same thing that we see here with Satan. See if I can get back there. There's a pride. There's appealing to this which you don't have. You can be like God. There's absolutely a rejection of the created purpose there to be, to have dominion over the earth. I mean, Adam and Eve were given an incredible authority, an incredible position there to exercise authority over the entire world. But that wasn't enough. They wanted to be like God, and so they ultimately rebelled. And so even there in Adam and Eve's sin, God has created them for mastery. I think we can rightly say God created them to be lords. It's right for them to desire mastery, the appropriate dominion and rule. It is right for them to want to have a rule over the garden and over the animals in the garden. And the problem is when they now insert a selfish desire to have a rule like God. It's appropriate for them to desire wisdom. But now it becomes an inappropriate when it's twisted to become a desire for the wisdom that God has. The desire for the wisdom which God has refused to you. It's a wicked desire that results in ultimate rebellion against the Creator. And so I would say in Adam and Eve's case that we see the same thing of them looking at the Creator, knowing the Creator is there, rejecting Him for the worship of self, exalting themselves to the diminishing or the attempted diminishing of God. And so we see sin entering the world by man rejecting God's will, seeking his own will. As I said before, I think we see from this moral evil is that which does not conform to the perfection, plan, and purpose of God. I'm just going to start on this, and we'll see how far we get. Why does God, or why did God allow moral evil? So we still, I've described where it came from, but we also recognize God is God. He, again, whether you say He permitted or planned the fall of man and the fall of Lucifer, if He is God, as described in the Bible, which He is, then He had every ability to stop it. Or at the very least, when Lucifer fell, God could have said, okay, you're gone. You don't exist anymore so that your corruption does not spread to the rest of the universe. It could have been quickly cut off and isolated and not continued on the course that it's on. And this is really where it comes down to is, well, why has God allowed it? Why is He allowing evil to continue? And there are a lot of answers. And I would say most of them are wrong, in my opinion. And this is another area where as we're walking through some of these that I think are wrong answers, there's some brilliant men who accept some of the answers and would espouse some of the answers that I'm going to reject, and they would reject some of the answers that I'm going to espouse. So there's a lot of room here for differences of understanding, because for the most part we are talking about conclusions, trying to draw conclusions from a wide range of texts that don't speak directly to the question, which means we need to be very careful with our answers. And so I'm going to say these are answers I think are wrong, but at the same time, most of them I'm not going to be willing to fight too hard over. First and foremost, first wrong answer is evil is necessary. And this is one, just to let you know, As I said, smart guys that disagree with me on this, no less than Jonathan Edwards and John Piper, both affirm that evil is necessary to some degree or another. But some of the reason for this belief that evil is necessary, and the basic argument, and I would say the most persuasive argument, is for us to really understand the holiness and the justice of God, evil needs to be present. That we wouldn't know, just what it means that God is holy if there wasn't the sin there that allows us to see it. It doesn't give God enough credit, in my opinion. I think God absolutely could have created a universe in which He did not allow evil, and we still have a full view of His holiness and justice. So again, that's very, very subjective, this first one. But I think it's worth noting, at the very least, that I disagree with the idea that evil is necessary. Another one is that evil has always existed. This is kind of the yin-yang view of creation, that as long as there's been anything, including God, there's always been this counterpart to God. And we would say very adamantly from Scriptures, no, evil has not always existed. Again, Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, at the end of creation week, God says that everything He created is very good. In Ezekiel 28, we see the definite declaration that even Lucifer was perfect in the day of his creation. And so that there was a creation in which there was no evil. And we know that God is holy. In His presence there is no evil. He is not evil in any way. And so it is utterly impossible for evil to have always existed. If you want to measure that in eternity, outside of time, or you want to measure that in time, from the day of creation, there's always been evil. You have to say on both sides that no, it is not. But evil is something that came into the world, that as a result of Satan's pride, we see the origination of evil. Some would say that evil is a natural part of physical matter. If you're familiar with the term Gnosticism, this is a major tenet of Gnosticism. It's actually present in some modern religions too, that physical matter is just, it's going to be evil. And in fact, some Christian philosophers and theologians have espoused this, that because God is holy and He is the creator, He can be perfectly and unchangingly holy. But because we are creation, we are, of necessity less than the creator, and yet we cannot be and are not perfectly holy. And so they would say that it's inherent to physical nature, physical matter, that it's going to corrupt or is corrupted. Gnosticism actually teaches that an evil being created the physical world, that the creator, the actual chief God over all, is perfect, and He had no part in creating anything, but rather basically a being that came from Him, which came, and then another being came from that being, and then another being came from that being, and you get down quite a few rungs of beings. Eventually, one of them creates the universe. This evil being creates the universe, and it's inherently evil because its creator was evil. And again, we know the universe was not created evil, nor does it necessarily follow that just because we are creation, that it is inevitable that we are going to fall, or that it's inherent to us that we are evil. But God, in His holiness, is able to create righteous creatures which will remain righteous. And one of the reasons I say that is because of Revelation 21 and 22. God is going to make a new creation which will endure eternally in perfection. So it's certain that we will, in a physical form, We're given a new body. It's still a physical body. It's glorified. It's significantly unlike this body, while still being significantly like this body. But we will have this physical body and yet will not sin. And so we cannot say that evil is inherent to physical matter. Some say evil is an illusion. Christian Science says this. It's just our wrong thinking. There's no such thing as evil, in which we recognize that evil's real. Anybody who looks around the world, says, okay, evil's real. And you have to, I really think you have to be quite deluded to think that evil is an illusion. God was powerless to prevent evil. Again, I would adamantly deny this one. We know that God is all-powerful. This ties in some with the evil is necessary, but this is more the idea just simply that evil was going to come in existence and God had to permit it. For one reason or another, He couldn't stop it. And so and which I would say, God is all-powerful. He does all that He desires. And so that if evil exists, it is because He desired to permit its existence. At the very least, desired to permit its existence. Now, at the same time, the last one is that God is morally responsible for the existence of evil. And this is where it gets very challenging. Because we say God could have stopped evil, but He didn't. Therefore, some conclude He is culpable. He's morally responsible for evil. That God in some way was immoral and not stopping evil. Now, right off the bat, my first big problem with that is we are not capable of determining the morality of God's actions. Now, I know I said last week, and I stand by it, that God's actions are always in accord with His character. So it's not just a matter that everything that God does is right because God does them, so that we say essentially, well, God did it, must be right, because who can question God? We would say everything God does is morally, objectively right in accord with His unchanging character. So it's not right just by virtue of the fact that God did it, but it's right by virtue of the fact that God is holy. And everything He does is holy, good, and righteous. And we can understand it to some extent as holy, good, and righteous. That's an important part of that. God's holiness is not what we would call evil, if we're thinking rightly. I know our world nowadays calls evil good and good evil. But if we're thinking at all rightly, we're going to recognize God's righteousness as righteous. Here, we come to this moral aspect of it and we say, I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the authority. I don't have the wisdom. I don't possess any of the faculties necessary to actually evaluate the moral responsibility that God possesses for the existence of evil. I can't judge this. I have no authority to put God on the stand and say, now you explain to me why you allowed evil and how your allowance of evil is a good thing. That is an outrageous arrogance to assume that we can. So we have to go back to what God declares about Himself. As we saw several weeks ago, that every work of God is righteous. He is just in all His ways. He never does wrong. And so that in the permission of evil, we cannot say in any way that now God has morally failed, that He has some obligation to His holiness that He did not meet in permitting this evil. But rather that God's permission of evil is holy and just and good. Now, there's a lot of ways that gets explained how it could be holy and just and good. I'm going to give a couple of them here in a second. One of them is what we already alluded to with when talking about evil is necessary. Some say, well, yes, it was good that God permitted evil because in the permission of evil, we have the full revelation of the justice, the glory, the righteousness, the mercy, the grace, and the compassion of God. If God had not allowed evil, then we would not have redemption. We would not know. And again, that I think has some persuasiveness to it. But that's some of how people explain, well, see, God's not morally guilty because, he has if you will, a greater purpose. And there are other possible answers that we could give that explain how God is righteous in permitting evil. Let me very quickly, just because I want to give you these so you can be thinking about them a little bit, let me give you 3 possible answers. I think these are possible. And that's as far as I want to say on it, and I think they're possible. But to better reveal God's glorious nature to His creation. So this goes back to some of what we've been talking about. I don't dispute that evil was permitted for the revelation of the glory of God. I dispute that evil is necessary for the revelation of the glory of God. And that would be the distinction I draw. And so it's possible, and I think Romans chapter 9 points us to this, that God permitted evil to reveal His glorious character to His creation. We also see, and I think Ephesians 2, speaking of our redemption, shows us that sin works so that God receives greater praise from men and angels. That as a result of sin and subsequent salvation, men now praise God even more richly. And then the third one, which I really like, is men will not know until they reach heaven. So that we're never going to fully understand this in this life. We may not fully understand it in heaven. But so I'll touch on those next week. I'll start with those next week, but that'll give you some things to be thinking on this week.